Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about Star Wars. More precisely, I would like to talk to you about the story problems people have brought up over the years regarding the prequel trilogy, and contrast that to the sequel trilogy, and talk about a project I did years ago that I'm thinking of revisiting and doing again. Let me explain. Years ago, after hearing endlessly about the problems with the Star Wars prequel trilogy, I elected to do script revisions of them. I was just learning to write back then, so a script revision was actually seen as good, because I had read about how one of the ways you can learn to appreciate story is to simply revise someone else's as an exercise. This is not meant to promote plagiarism. In fact, the book that I got this from suggested public domain works. It was also not meant to be something you would necessarily release to the public. For example, if I revised Huckleberry Finn, that wouldn't necessarily mean I'm saying I could do it better than Mark Twain. It was his story, after all. It was just an exercise to learn what does and doesn't work in a story and how to make changes to a story that you're writing by using this other one as a template. And believe it or not, I have done script revision in the past, for pay. So these exercises have, in fact, paid off, as it were. But in my earlier days, I looked at the Star Wars prequels and decided to make 3 revisions. I ended up making 12 because I made a sort of custom out of it for a while. But the original project I set for myself was to do only 3 revisions. The reason I did 12 is because I had other ideas I wanted to explore, and I already had these movies in mind. But the original project had 3 types of revision. It had the minor revision, the moderate revision, and the major revision. I kept it alliterative. And each one had rules to go by. The conceit of the experiment was, I imagined that George Lucas had not made the films yet, and he simply approached me to do a revision of the script because he didn't feel something was quite right or working. So I was given the script of The Phantom Menace before The Phantom Menace was released. It is not yet Star Wars Episode 1 because it hasn't been filmed, but it is the script for it. And in each of the alternate timelines, because I did pretend these are different timelines, George Lucas gave me certain instructions and limitations. In the first timeline, George Lucas told me that I could not change his story. I could only make it tighter or make it work better. The rules were very simple. Every scene that the script says is in the film is in the film. I cannot add new scenes, and I cannot subtract them. I must only alter the existing scenes. Furthermore, I could not alter the actual story, at least in a mechanical fashion. Keep in mind these are fiction, though. Things that would qualify as a major change to the world would not necessarily be a major change to the script. A good example of that would be, what if the Galactic Republic were not a Galactic Republic, but a Galactic Monarchy? It could still be a democratic government. It could be a constitutional monarchy where the king either has no power at all and is purely ceremonial, or where the king has executive power but not legislative. But it could still have a democratic government under a monarchy. Monarchy does not mean non-democratic. Thus, you can preserve the themes of democracy over dictatorship that is prevalent in Star Wars. And it doesn't really matter if it's a republic or a monarchy. If Star Wars were a real world, though, the type of government and how it's arranged would be very important. But it doesn't really change the story if you change it. Now, I wouldn't actually be able to change the Galactic Republic into the Galactic Monarchy because the Galactic Republic was established in the previous films, and I obviously am trying to avoid contradicting those. But, and there is a but, given that the conceit of this film is that George Lucas approached me when he decided to make Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, I could completely ignore Episodes 2 and 3 until they were made. And the rules of my game, and it ultimately is a game, were very simple in regards to that as well. For the most part, all 3 scripts had the same rules. I could not add or subtract scenes. I could only change dialogue and specific actions within scenes, but I couldn't change them to such an extent that the overall story would change. The scenes still have to all be there and add up, which means I have to keep in mind all the scenes that come after this first scene. For instance, I couldn't kill Qui-Gon Jinn in the negotiation scene. I couldn't say that the gas actually did him in, but only Obi-Wan survived, because Qui-Gon is in the other scenes of the story. He has to live until the end. But I was allowed to change certain things. Dialogue and action, so long as it doesn't make those other scenes not work. However, what would qualify as a minor change in The Phantom Menace could create the need for a major change in the other 2, and there were 2 ways I could approach this. One is to pretend that all 3 scripts were written at the same time and to treat it as one big story that already existed. And in fact, I did decide to do that the second time I decided to pursue this, the second iteration, as it were, of my version of the scripts. But for the first ones, I wanted to keep the illusion that this was really happening, and Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, had not been written when Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, came out. Perhaps it was outlined, but the actual script didn't exist. So what I ended up doing was making this the rule. For The Phantom Menace, I could only change dialogue and specific actions, but I could not change the overall story, and I could not change any of the scenes. I could not add a scene or subtract a scene or alter it to such an extent that it would be radically different. It has to be the same story, and the characters have to end up in the same places by the end. But I can make revisions to see if I can make it tighter. However, if the revisions I made to The Phantom Menace required a change to Episodes 2 or 3, I was freely allowed to make those changes, even if those changes would force me to change a scene or even the whole story in a major way. For the second iteration of this project, I enslaved myself fully to the outline, pretending Lucas had written all 3 scripts at the same time, and I was given the same strictures. But for the first one, I didn't. In hindsight, I probably should have begun with the idea that all 3 were already written by Lucas when he handed them to me, because that is actually easier than the other one, but that's not what I did. I should have done what I'm doing here second, but I should have done what I did second first, and what I did first second, but still. I wrote, or rather revised, a version of the prequels as a result. For the moderate revision, though, I had to keep the same outline, the same summary of the story, what you might read on Wikipedia, for example. But I was allowed a great deal more liberty in making alterations. I didn't have to keep every scene that Lucas had, and I could add scenes, provided all of the characters began the story in the same way they began it in Lucas's and ended in the same way, and provided that they still went through the same general experiences. I could change the context of the experiences or the exact detail of the experiences. I could add or subtract certain other experiences to facilitate change, but the story has to be basically the same. However, I had a much freer hand. And for the major revision, I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. I could keep scenes in if I wanted, keep the outline if I wanted, or I could just chuck the whole script and write it from scratch. And I did eventually write my own version of the prequels from scratch. But in this case, I still drew most of my inspiration. I am still pretending to be a script doctor, and let's be perfectly honest, the only way the latter one would work would be one of two ways. Either I throw away George Lucas's story altogether and write my own, and he rejects the script, or I pretend he accepts it. It could be a little arrogant, but it's a good way of capping it off, because this is your story. Again, it was never intended to be anything that replaced the prequels. It was only intended as a writing exercise. I did, however, mention this writing exercise on a few forums I was on, and outlined what I had done. I don't remember if I ever posted the actual scripts, though, and I don't think I did. But it's been a while, and while I always remembered them, there was never a time when I forgot doing this project. I didn't really put much thought into it. Then the Disney sequels came about, and I remembered the project and wondered if I could do the same for the sequels, and lo and behold, while looking through some old data, I found my old script revisions. I'm thinking of posting them on the internet on perhaps a website, and maybe going over them in YouTube videos. I would like to discuss the Disney Star Wars films as well, though, and outline the things that I thought about them. I'm a critic of Disney Star Wars. I never really liked Disney Star Wars films. But I do think some of the criticism in the fandom menace has gone overboard. That's not to say that I disagree with all of it. In fact, some of the things that I agree with, I think they take a little too far, and other things I disagree with altogether. It's rather like Star Trek, where the current Star Trek shows, Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard, have things I feel are valid criticisms, but some things I don't think are valid, and some things I think people are only invoking because they are angry. At any rate, I decided to revive my old project. Only this time, I want to look at the Disney sequel trilogy and see if they can be salvaged with script revision. Though this is quite a different challenge to what I did with the prequels, because now I almost have to look at all of them as already existing. The biggest problem with Disney's sequel trilogy actually isn't that the films are bad individually. I believe they are bad individually, but that's not the greatest problem. The greatest problem is a lack of consistency between them. So, the new conceit isn't that Disney came to me to revise scripts before they were made. I might still do a project with that as the conceit, but the conceit of this one is that Disney is going to use something akin to Star Trek's holodeck to recreate the films and make a new definitive version. They are going to decanonize their sequel trilogy, but they don't want to let it go completely. So what they're going to do is digitally alter the film. They are going to go back and create photorealistic CGI in order to get the actors to do new things. They may preserve certain scenes as they originally were, but they are going to create alternate forms. So my task isn't to revise the scripts before the films are made. It is to see if I can make a coherent story out of the 3 existing movies by revising the story. And I'm going to do it in the same way. There are going to be 3 versions. The minor revision, where I change as little as possible. The moderate revision, where I have more freedom but still have to keep the overall story. And I do think this would be the most successful one. And the major one, where I'm allowed to have basically a free reign. The only rule of the major one is I have to use the same characters and general story ideas. To be honest, I would rather have George Lucas's version have been made, but This is a writing exercise, and I'm hoping to illustrate what exactly went wrong with Disney's sequel trilogies by engaging in this, by showing how, even in a minor revision, you could have made it better by the few small tweaks. This does, however, pose a problem, because unlike the prequels, there is a divided fandom. For instance, there are Reylo fans. They're the people who want Rey and Kylo to end up together, and there are people who, for want of a better term, are not Reylos. They don't really like the idea of Reylo. Granted, if I were doing 2 iterations, I could simply make one iteration a Reylo iteration and the other not, but the question is which one. But I'm doing 3. So, what I've decided to do is 6. A minor, moderate, and major revision that is Reylo, and a minor, moderate, and major revision that is not Reylo. This would appease both sets of fans. Because you have to remember, unlike Disney, I can do more than this, more than 2 versions, and unlike Disney, the purpose for doing this is to see if I could salvage the story. If I am successful, then I will have illustrated the writing flaws of Disney from a structural point of view, while producing both effects. Because if you're just looking at the mechanics of storytelling, it really doesn't matter if Reylo fans get what they want, or if you go another direction with them not getting together. The audience may prefer a certain outcome, and in this case, there's about half the fandom that prefers one outcome and half that prefers another. But we're not talking about that. The point of this project is not about who gets what. And what I'm afraid of is if I choose one side or the other, for instance, if I choose the Reylo side, then the people who don't like Reylo will simply reject it out of hand without really looking at the point. And the same thing can be said the other way around, where if I reject the Reylo ending, Reylo fans may not really listen to me. So I feel in order to make the point I wish to make to the audience, and unlike my first project, this one is explicitly intended to have an audience, I need to do it both ways. Because in the end, I think you could have had a good story, at least on a technical level. You could have at least had a well-written story that ended with Rey and Kylo not ending up together or even just being enemies. But I also believe that you could have had a good story where it ended with him in a romantic relationship. I don't really think either outcome is inherently bad in terms of story structure. You may think it's inherently bad in terms of themes or personal preference. You may even think it is a disgusting idea, either way. But the point I'm trying to make is about writing. A good example of that would be the Twilight novels, which people who don't like Twilight may find problems with that the fans of Twilight don't. And if I'm looking at it from a neutral writing perspective, rather than from what I would prefer, then while I do think Twilight has certain flaws to the story and how it's written, some of the things people who don't like Twilight complain about aren't really flaws. They're things they don't like, but they're not really flaws. So, if, for instance, I write a Reylo script, one that ends with Rey and Kylo being together, and people who don't like Reylo don't like it because they don't like Rey and Kylo together, that wouldn't necessarily invalidate what I've done, because what I'm doing is showing how it could have worked, at least structurally. And you shouldn't confuse whether you like the story I tell with whether or not it is structurally sound. I'm trying to make the Star Wars Disney sequels structurally sound. I'm trying to tell a coherent story that is good in the sense that it is coherent. I don't mean good as in it's necessarily going to be a good story. I am still working in constraints of what Disney said. Though it is my belief that there is no such thing as a bad story. There's only bad execution. I'm not so arrogant to say that my execution will be good either, though. But what I am saying is that I think that with a little more thought, you could have made this work. And after I'm done with this project, I may well go on to another one. I don't know if I will go into full scripts or not. I could just do outlines. But some other questions that are raised are, what could Disney have done better after The Force Awakens, in which I could just ignore The Last Jedi and produce an entirely new story that go in the middle. I could do other revisions to explain what Disney could have done better, because the sequel trilogy is a richer test subject for this kind of project, because it was so ill-conceived and it was so poorly executed. You can show a number of mistakes, and my channel is educational, so I want to show the mistakes people make in writing. While the prequels are good at showing that, the sequels are better because there are more mistakes. In a way, perhaps in a perverse way, being bad is good for my ends. At any rate, I also intend on doing a few commentaries on Star Wars. The commentaries will, hopefully at least, explain my thoughts on the Star Wars Disney trilogy and what went wrong, and even some defenses of the Disney sequel trilogy when I feel they're being unfairly criticized. At any rate, I can't promise you when these will be released. My life has stabilized considerably since a few months ago when I was going through some problems. But I have so much work I have to catch up on now that while my life is stabilized, I haven't even gotten back to all the emails that I've promised people, but I am working on it. I'm doing about 5 emails a day, and I have about 150 left. If I promised you I would email you back, I will, even if you've lost interest. I apologize for the delay. I'm also going to be releasing soon my analysis of Skeptic's Annotated Bible, which I put a lot more focus on even than emailing people because it was therapeutic for me at the moment. But I do want to do these Star Wars videos because I feel they are important in a way. They are important in a broader literary sense. And I think enough time has passed that we can maybe have cooler heads to examine it. I didn't want to put these out anyway when all the fiasco was going on, so even if I were on my game and putting out 3 or 4 videos a week, I would not have touched Star Wars until around now anyway. It's still relevant, it's still new enough to be relevant, people are still talking about it, but I'm hoping that I can avoid the pratfalls of a fresh wound, or of an open controversy. At any rate, I will let you go, as I have nothing else to say. May the Force be with you. Thank you. God bless. And goodbye.